When people talk about sound in video games, usually the conversation revolves around cool or memorable sound effects.
Here we go!
But there's a lot more to it than just that. Games as a medium can only use two of the human senses to present information to the player, those being audio and visuals. That means the sound is half of your in-game perception. Now you might be thinking, sound isn't that important when I play games, but you'd be surprised to find that most of the popular games today rely more heavily on sound to alert the player than their visuals. Games like Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege,
Biohazard container located. Op 4 last operator standing. Secure the
PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and Fortnite Battle Royale all use distinct sound effects to alert the player of enemies, objectives, and their surroundings. All of what you just heard is a result of expert sound design. What really is sound design, you might ask? To quote Wikipedia, sound design is the art and practice of creating sounds for a variety of needs. Let me expand on that. In film, sound design is used to build the audience's immersion in the presented setting. This is done through layering recorded audio samples. Now those samples are usually captured through the use of Foley, which is the reproduction of sounds in a contained environment. An example of a designed sound would be your average gunshot sound effect. This is one I created myself. With gun sound effects, usually I like to take a low, medium, and high frequency and then layer them all to create one coherent sound. So first we're starting off with the lows, which gives a lot of weight to the firearm. Then we're going to move to the mid-range frequencies, where most of the body comes from. And then finally, we get to the highs, which give us the initial crack. I also like to add some metallic sounds to the high end to emphasize the slide in the trigger. And finally, we add an original Foley sample from the gun that we're trying to recreate. This keeps it grounded in reality. And the end result is a crisp and punchy gunshot. This style of sound design is called hyperrealism, which, like the name implies, is the use of exaggeration with specific elements of a sound. Hyperrealism is the difference between this and this. Minor things like mechanical bolts and slides are amplified, along with the initial crack and the traveling noise of the bullet. Because of the extremely frequent use of hyperrealism in media, specifically in games and film, most people wouldn't think twice about these sounds being artificially constructed, which in turn makes them the standard for cinematic realism. But what if something doesn't exist in the real world? How do you create a sound for that? Now that is where the real fun comes in. I'm going to use one of my favorite games, Halo Combat Evolved, for an example. The first step in this process is figuring out what sound is the device going to create. Are there exhaust ports? Is there a charge period? Are there any mechanical parts? After establishing what sound it'll need, similar to realistic weapon design, we need to get some Foley recordings. But then we start to branch off from realistic sound design. Like with any sound, we require some amount of layering, but the main component of science fiction sound design is the use of sound processing. Processing is the alternation of audio signals through the use of one or more effects. Those effects could be anything from reverb, chorus, or even simple equalization. Sound designers use these processors to create sounds that would never occur in reality, giving the object an alien feel. But because the bass sounds are recorded in the real world, they also have a sense of groundedness, allowing the listener to accept that as a realistic sound for that device. The final, and in my eyes the most important part of designing a sound, one which people tend to overlook, is the worldization. Worldization is the practice of placing sounds that you've created into an auditory world. That would include synthesizing sound reflections off surfaces, or any other variables that could affect how the sound travels and gets perceived. If you were to simply just use sound without any worldization in a game, it would completely break the immersion of the player. Here's an example of a sound effect without any worldization. Notice how without worldization, the sound feels flat and lacks a presence within the environment. Now I'm going to play a sound effect with worldization. Notice the difference? By simply adding delays, reverb, and environmental sounds, we can give the sound a sense of space and presence in the world around it. Even though worldization is a relatively simple process, it is one of the most important parts of building an immersive game world. Alright, so now we've created some nice sounds and we tweaked them to fit our world. But what game world are we actually in? Our perception of the world as a whole comes down to the atmosphere, the true world building. Every single detail placed by the art team must be given its own unique sound, as well as the invisible ambiance of the environment. Wind blowing through trees, animals in the distance, industrial machines, and people interacting. All of this builds a convincing soundscape around the player. To better explain what I mean, I'll play a few examples of excellent game soundscapes. As you listen, I want you to try and identify all of the different components that build the world that you're listening to. What all these games demonstrated here, in their own ways, is what I think the most important part of building a great soundscape is: a mixture of density and clarity. While there may be dozens of sounds playing at once, each one of them are pronounced and have their own level of importance in the mix. For a player investing hours in a game, you want to be able to identify what is going on immediately, but also find something new every time you play. From the jingle of your character's backpack, to a guitar playing by the campfire. I hope that this little essay has helped you appreciate the amount of effort that goes into designing sounds for some of your most beloved games. If it weren't for the dedicated engineers and programmers working behind the scenes, a lot of what we play today wouldn't be nearly as memorable, or even enjoyable for that matter. Hopefully next time you're playing your favorite game, you'll stop for a second and appreciate the world that you're so invested in. Thank you.